Did rap kill rock and roll?
Kiss, Gene Simmons
says rock and roll is dead. Did rap kill rock and roll? But not only that, you'll want to watch and discover how an old black blues player created rock and roll. Is hip hop the new counterculture movement? Stay tuned to find out. From the mid 1900s to the early 2000s, one type of music stood out from the rest: rock and roll. Rock and roll set the stage for counterculture, social commentary, and rebels with a cause. This led to changes in not only the music industry, but the political and cultural habits you don't even know you have that are prevalent throughout society. But the surprising fact is that rock and roll is a stolen genre, where one culture poached the goods from another culture and relabeled this music as their own. And now, many say that rock and roll has fizzled out as a genre, failing to rank on Spotify, and sales have dropped for decades. And rock and roll's popularity pales in comparison to hip-hop's global audience.
Gene Simmons
said rock and roll died in the 80s. Was he correct?
Studying trends online for how much traffic the search term rock and roll has compared to hip-hop, the data doesn't lie. In every single state in America, hip-hop averages 75 to 90% more web traffic than searches for rock and roll on both Google and YouTube. Is Adam Levine from Maroon 5 right? Is rock and roll dead? And did hip-hop really kill rock and roll?
Rock and roll is undisputedly American music that came from Americans. But which Americans? In the 1940s and early 1950s, rock and roll came from African American music, such as jazz, rhythm and blues, boogie woogie, electric blues, gospel, jump blues, and to a lesser degree, even country music. In the 50s, rock and roll got its name, but in reality, rock and roll's roots can be heard in blues records from the 1920s and the 1930s. I'll bet you never heard of the first rock and roll star, Robert Leroy Johnson. Known as the father of the Delta blues, Robert Johnson was a traveling bluesman with only 2 recording sessions, one in San Antonio, Texas in 1936, and one in Dallas, Texas in 1937. His album, King of the Delta Blues, demonstrated for the first time in history a driving bass beat on a guitar instead of a piano, also called the Boogie Shuffle and the classic Chicago Shuffle beat. But how does this relate to rock and roll being considered white music? And has rap killed off rock and roll?
Famous black rock and roll innovator Chuck Berry adapted this classic Chicago Shuffle beat for his songs Roll Over Beethoven and the all-time favorite Johnny B. Good. If you've never heard this song, decades later it was featured on the movie Back to the Future, played by Michael J. Fox. A black artist, Lionel Richie, influenced Tim May, who was the musician actually playing Johnny B. Good in Back to the Future. Chuck Berry took the swing rhythm of Robert Johnson's songs like Sweet Home Chicago and changed it into a 4/4 meter that popularized the genre. This black blues player, Robert Johnson, that history seems to have forgotten, was actually inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as the first ever rock star who went on to influence Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, and also the artists who came after this generation like Jimi Hendrix, who cites Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and blues artists like Muddy Waters as his influences. But the cultural impact of Robert Johnson on both rock and roll and rap went beyond the music.
Robert Johnson created the modern blues that rock and roll was based on, and rock and roll triggered the cultural revolution of the 1960s, leading to the civil rights movement, the fall of President Richard Nixon, and the end of the Vietnam War. Without Johnson, there would be no counterculture as we know it. Black culture has universally influenced white culture and how we live our everyday lives, even if you are unaware of it. The kicker is, now many are saying rock and roll is dead. It seems like a full circle now that hip-hop is doing what rock can no longer fulfill, becoming the voice to the voiceless, the voice to the rebels that defy contemporary standards and accepted social norms. Hip-hop has become the voice of the people and the new counterculture. But did rap kill rock and roll? Let's find out. From Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Won't Be Televised to DJ Kool Herc's block parties on 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, hip-hop was originally the voice of historically oppressed people seeking an outlet to simply talk about their lives and what was going on beyond the surface. From the Underground Railroad, where quilts contain messages on where to go to be free, to the NWA's FBI banned album, Straight Outta Compton, music and art have served as a vehicle of expression and freedom. Hip-hop is multifaceted, including MCing and rapping, DJing and turntablism, to breakdancing and b-boy battles, to graffiti art exposés. Other cultures have continued to borrow from it. Even graffiti can be a form of protest and social commentary, with artists like Banksy speaking their message through art. From the 1980s, when Run DMC collaborated with Aerosmith, to the late 1990s to early 2000s Bling era, to the 2006 to 2009 ATL trap scene, and the SoundCloud rapper era that followed, we've seen hip-hop continue to change and expand in both what it sounded like and the audience it attracted. Just like Drake popularized rap to millions of people whose primary music was pop, and the streaming era that we are currently in, one thing hip-hop seems to have that rock and roll has not, is the ability to continue to evolve and diversify.
When Elvis took black music and rebranded it as his own, as many did, it seemed that only after white musicians played black music that rock and roll was accepted by the masses. Chuck Berry and Little Richard created the foundation of modern rock and roll, inspired by Robert Johnson's Chicago Shuffle. And this foundation was taken and appropriated by Elvis into his music. Just like British rock bands such as the Beatles took Johnson's rhythm and blues to create the beat music that led to a form of rock and roll revivalism. However, it became clear that rock and roll became whitewashed, and African Americans started moving on to new genres like funk, soul, and disco, which were some of the earliest and biggest influences of hip-hop. Fast forward to when
Gene Simmons
says rock and roll was killed in the 1980s. This coincides exactly with the timeline when hip-hop started to gain mainstream appeal. The rise of electronic production decreased the cost to make music, which helped pave the way for hip-hop music, as aspiring musicians had to find a cost-effective way to make music. They had drum machines and a voice recorder, and that's all they needed.
Surprisingly enough, many have said Nickelback killed rock and roll. It was a bland, almost smooth jazz Lawrence Welch meets Kenny G version of rock that took all the fire out of this genre. Some say MTV killed rock. In the 90s, MTV reigned supreme, and with its focus on hair, grunge, and alternative rock, it may have allowed corporations to push agendas and make less talented artists more famous than perhaps they should have been. This could have watered down the genre. And later, MTV's focus on reality TV didn't help things either. Did grunge music kill off rock and roll too? Other sources cited for rock and roll's death include clear channel radio stations, where DJs were literally paid excessive sums of money to push a specific narrative in the music shaping American culture, like the proliferation of alternative rock. Alternative rock bands started taking audiences away from classic rock and roll groups and pushed them towards bands like Marcy Playground, Korn, and Nirvana, who won Best Alternative Music Performance at the 1996 Grammy Awards. I've even heard people argue with me that rap isn't even music at all, but just vocals over drum loops, but they failed to consider groups like The Roots out of Philadelphia, who frequently perform with live bands with live instruments. Or they forget even Kanye West's early albums like Late Registration, using real live instrumentation and superior production quality. Or even in Austin, Texas, MC Overlord, who is famous for performing with live instrument bands. Can we really say that rap killed rock? With rap's lower cost to get started making music, rock fans have even said that the drum machine killed rock and roll. That and auto-tune. But what if they are all wrong?
The reality is, hip-hop has become the second wave of countercultural energy with a focus on race, gender, and personal identity. Black music has always been a catalyst for cultural revolutions. Does rock and roll, originally stolen from black culture, even represent the American people anymore?
That's a great point. I think it's not so much that rock and roll has died. It may just be that rock had evolved to fit what people want. And people want something more than what rock used to be. That's why we see so much genre bending with rock rap groups, from Limp Bizkit to Rage Against the Machine to modern rap integrating multiple styles of music.
Rock was very experimental when it began in the heart of counterculture, which led to heavier metal bands of the late 70s, then the punk movement and post-punk movements such as grunge.
The constant emergence of new subgenres of rock kept rock and roll interesting, but also has slowly led away from the traditional classic rock sounds of the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and Led Zeppelin. Will rock and roll make a comeback? And will it even be called rock anymore? We're from the jump. Subscribe.